Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi everyone, I'm Mclnerny and I'm from Microsoft Research Cambridge, and I'm going to talk to you about this project we've been doing for the last 14 months, which has been supported by Microsoft Research Connections. And yeah, it's called Predicting Where on Earth Life Is and Will Be. So just off talking about predicting, like what that really means, and like it's pretty well demonstrated in this little video clip, which is our distinguished chief scientist at Microsoft Research Cambridge, Chris Bishop. Ooh. I'll just turn the sound off. Yeah, and he's got this steel ball. I don't want the sound if that's okay. No. He's got this steel ball on a big wire, and he's going to let it swing out away from him and let it swing back towards his face. And like everyone's clapping, everyone thinks this is amazing, but he knew that that wasn't going to hit his face. Physics is pretty predictable, so it's pretty boring. But down here, this little guy here is his son. Like, he wasn't willing to let himself be maimed in front of his son. So like physics is pretty predictable, but that prediction lets you sort of dodge danger if you've got a steel ball coming towards your face. But it also lets people do like massive experimentation, like at CERN, which costs $4.4 billion or pounds, but it's one of the biggest scientific enterprises anyone's seen. But what I'm going to talk to you today is about the world's biggest ever experiment, which is to do with climate change and how humans are manipulating the whole Earth system. So ecologists are interested in these sort of natural resources which help support life, but we're interested in how things like population growth affect pressure on these systems, also like all the emissions in terms of pollution and carbon dioxide emissions, how that affects the Earth's life support system, how agriculture taking out massive amounts of tropical rainforest and natural ecosystems, how that affects the world, and then how that all ties in with economic systems as well. So like this is a system. What affects the Earth's life system is also affected by the Earth's life system. So like this is quite complicated stuff on the face of it. So really, like, we're talking about the world's worst experiment here, and it is of serious concern. Like if we manipulate the Earth system in such a way that we damage it, like that actually affects our day-to-day life. Like, people did think the LHC might create a black hole and the whole Earth would be destroyed, but physics is probably predictable enough that you knew that wasn't actually going to happen. But it's the world's worst experiment, climate change, because we've got no replication and we've got no control, so it's quite hard to actually derive what is a climate change effect versus some other background effects which are happening. And also we're losing all our experimental material as we go along. Like, if we don't actually make measures which affect our study experiment in the right way, things will go extinct, so we won't ever be able to run this experiment again. And also there's no off switch for climate change. Like, we're affecting the Earth system and it's going on and on. And I think the final sort of analogy to draw and comparison is that for the LHC, we've got tremendous amounts of collaboration between scientists to actually get it going, but maybe in the study of climate change and ecology, we don't actually have this sort of teamwork going on at the moment. So that was just an introduction into the area. So would you really trust ecological predictions? I would never put my face in front of a steel ball which was determined by our knowledge of the ecological systems. So, so in terms of predicting where things are and where they will be, like, this is of big economics and social importance. where will carbon be in the future? Where will forests be in 100 years' time, and how much of those forests will be there? Where can I plant my crops? And where can we preserve biodiversity? These are all the sort of issues that we want to get at. And they're things which are of importance. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sees these as like key sources of uncertainty in what is going to happen in the future, and they really want new methods and tools to address these problems. And this is our research area on this project. So from all that, like, it's a big experiment, it's of great importance, and this is the methodology that I research, and from that big importance, it's usually brought down to a model with correlation. So to model a species distribution, you usually combine information on where that species occurs with layers of environmental variables, pull out some sort of correlative relationship, and use that to predict forward. But that isn't really as complicated as maybe the system underlying it is. So that affects our way, how we can actually predict. So this has led people to really criticize this area. So it believes in a remarkable structure, remarkably simple structure to ecological systems. Like they don't just work by correlation and simple associations, and it means that the predictions aren't actually the predicted associations between climate and species aren't actually any better than chance, and also their predictive ability in terms of whether, if the climate warms, whether a species will go north or south. The results from these sort of methods are no better than tossing a coin. So, like, this is pretty bad news for ecology and everyone. But then, taking it down even further, people use this sort of software quite a lot to do this kind of regression analysis, and this has developed lots of criticisms of its own, because you can put data in and you can get stuff out of it really, really easy without even having to know what the algorithms are underneath. And for a scientist, that's kind of well, yeah, most people would say something worse than criticism. But this is just one of lots of different methods that people use out there. But this has drawn in lots of non-scientific issues with species distribution modelling. So people say it's more computational convenience than actual hard science, and it's also fragmented the field. So different software are often built around different research communities, or actually vice versa, research communities around software. So then in review papers, they can have no common citations. And then also people are really worried about the policies that are being built because of indiscriminate use of software for science. So, like in the words of Mark Abbott last night, it's you've got these knowledge ecosystems which is built around like the scientific questions, the policy demands, the software use. So, like, it's quite a complicated issue to get into. So, yeah, some people do live in these sort of Italian villages where like, they do come and go sometimes, but also there's some areas in this science where people are in these fortresses, and they might not even know that they're in the fortresses, which is the worst thing. So they're not communicating beyond their domain. So just to take Mark's analogies even further from last night, the kind of science that we're attempting to do at the moment, it's more towards the jungle situation. But I think it's more like in a botanical garden where you get lots of species which would never live together normally, put them side by side, and then try and learn about all those species at the same time. And like, so we call this sort of scientific approach joined up ecology. Like, we're trying to think about the theory and statistics at exactly the same time as we think about how we're going to visualize those results and design the user interface for these software. And we've been trying to understand the sociology of these scientists at the same time as like being able to talk to them on a deep level about the philosophy of that subject. So like, it is immensely ambitious to try and do all these components at the same time, but we believe it's kind of the way we have to do it to actually affect that scientific discipline. So I'll just briefly talk a bit about the science, if that's okay. So the big problem with correlating two things together is that you just assume that what you're seeing is the truth. But in ecology, actually, let's put it differently. So we might have a species and it might respond to temperature in a certain way. So there's certain temperatures that it likes and there's certain temperatures it doesn't like so much. So we want to get at that sort of response curve so that we can predict how it would vary with temperature, say in terms of climate change. But what we might see in the real world isn't, it might not have fulfilled its potential response to that climate because it might just not have had time to, in the areas that it's reached. And also, it might not have been able to reach all those places because it can't disperse far enough. So then, so there'd be like a dispersal limitation. Or it might not be in all the places that it could be because another species is out competing it. So what you observe is different from what it actually could do because of competition. And then similarly, you get some more boring ones, which are like statistical artifacts. So you might not have sampled everywhere in the world, so you might not have information on everywhere where a species does occur, just because you haven't gone there. And also, you might not have measured the temperatures right in the first place. So then you've got some statistical artifacts built into your data. And we see these things as like the 5 big problems for this research area at the moment. But luckily, 3 of them have kind of got proof of principles of how you'd solve those problems, so we don't have to worry about those so much. And I'll briefly whisk through some work that we've been doing on these other 2. So firstly, like a lot of the data that we deal with is at really large geographic scales, and data might just be recorded, like one piece of data in terms of temperature, say, it might be recorded for a really, really large grid cell, so it might be 5 by 5 kilometers. And then in our data it says it has exactly 1 temperature, rather than like a fully varying temperature up and down hills, etc., etc. So this is called regression dilution. So when you try and get out the environmental response that you need to be able to predict what is going to happen with climate change, you just get the wrong answer because the way that all the numbers are averaged out within the data means that you actually get like a squashed response. So that is really, really important because that means that all the predictions used in policy could potentially be over predictions. So whether that lulls policy into a false sense of security or not will depend on all the methods that people have used. So you can see that the importance of this statistical method is actually quite important a long way down the line once you use that information to inform policy. So we did a statistical validation of a new method that we did where we can pretty much perfectly retrieve that response by using some Bayesian methods where we have latent variables. So like I won't bore you with the details, but by using a bit of ecological understanding, we can actually retrieve a closer representation of what we think is going on underneath. So like not just applying computational methods to everything and getting it a little bit wrong. Instead, we're taking a different approach where we're just really thinking about what we need to do with that data to get the right information out. I'll skip over this. So then, so we've done that one in effect as well. So then we've got biotic interactions to do as well. So this has been a big problem for species distribution modeling for, I don't know, probably 15 years now, that people talk about it in every single paper, but no one provides a solution. So foolishly, we thought that we could solve it, and it took quite a while to work it out. But what we're doing here is trying to work out what effect each species is at the was working out what the environment is on the species. Really resolute data. So we our method with this as well. So modelling all the different species of different set models and try and it's complicated. Well, actually, ecologically that. So what this is, say we've got that red at the top. We model data of a species, but with methods we actually get the live response species. We don't actually observe this. What we infer the species in the absence of all other species, and this is for climate change because if species exist, say going to do it for every species at the same time. And quite complicated from the well, what so over like change that use the on species distributions. In principle, it's a model algorithm. People could implement out. If we cast our minds back to the beginning of the talk, there was people have that sort of makes quite convenient. So this would be software the best. So this software sociology where people use we twice. Every analysis is every analysis, computational research provide them need to take that into account. Well, yeah, and they also like to decompose analyses and recompose them later. So that means like tear everything apart, make sure it's all right for the species that they are modelling, but then be able to recompose it back up into something that they can run in batch mode or on clusters, etc., etc. So, like people want to take the computation to the data, but I think the most important message that we got out of this was let the scientist into the computation. Like, a lot of the scientists feel that the structure of the computational systems that they're using actually just puts them on the outside, and they can't actually affect what they are doing in the way that they want to. And that's just purely because of the software. So we need to take that into consideration. So then we did the interviews, and then we did an online survey. So we developed a survey based on all that, the stuff that we found out, and we got about 600 replies in a month, which, given our short time horizons for this project, was really good. So of those 600 people who used species distribution models, only 25% said that the species distribution modeling methods were suitable to the study system, i.e. they didn't really think that correlation was the right thing to be doing. And then only a quarter of them said that it was suitable to their data. So yeah, like 3/4 of people are saying that it isn't really suitable to their system or their data, but they did it anyway. And then about a fifth said that they understood the methods that they were implementing. So like 78% of people are not really sure what the method is that they're doing, but they're doing it anyway. And a lot of people said that it needs improvement. So, like, considering most people are using it, they don't understand it, and they don't think it suits their system, that's surprising. But then 94% of them said that they could do something else. So that's really surprising, that they're using something that they don't think is suitable, but they had a different choice. So scientists might not like or understand their methods, but they could use it anyway, and this is partly this computational convenience issue. So like, if we say that our scientific methods that I showed you before were better, like, maybe people wouldn't use them because these other things are more convenient for them. So we have to take all these things into account. So like, but most people use only 2 of these software. So considering there's like 20 odd software available, it's surprising that 76% just use these 2. So R is probably the most widely thing that's used in ecology for all kinds of analyses, and species distribution modeling is no different, and it's a syntax based interaction that you have with the software, versus Mclnerny, which is click and go. You just have drop-down menus, and you can produce amazing interactive visualizations within like 10 minutes of downloading the software, basically. So these are kind of at different ends of the scale of what software is available. So you need to be able to code, and you need to be able to use a mouse. That's kind of the difference. But then what users were saying like, makes you a little bit worried about the situation within the science, because non-scientific factors are affecting the directions in the science. So these are very different software. So in R, you can kind of create all kinds of analyses, and like, if you really want to, you can write new C code and have it linked into your R code, etc., etc. Whereas in Mclnerny, you're kind of limited to what buttons it's actually got. So unsurprisingly, you get lots of independent researchers who are more technically experienced using R, and Mclnerny users are usually younger, but these are the people who are doing species distribution modeling work always or most of the time, who are using the less creative software. And they're often guided by what it says in peer-reviewed articles, which isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, like it's what someone said and it's got into a journal. Yeah, these people who use R have got say that they have control of the tasks that they want to do, whereas Mclnerny users say that less frequently. But Mclnerny users say, it takes me a short time to become effective and productive, and it takes a few steps to actually complete the task that they want to do. So, like, this is just some preliminary analysis, but it does start to show that non-scientific factors are creeping into the scientific process. So as well as creating software, you should be creating the teaching to go alongside that. So you're producing the scientists who are appropriate to your software. So like it's another level to the problem. I'll just skip through there. And then on top of that, we did a co-authoring study. So we looked at who had published with who in the scientific literature. So trying to get a bit of a fix on how software developers interact with the scientific community. So these are just the collaboration, the co-authoring links between developers. So if there's a line, they've published a paper together, and then the size of the circle is how many papers they've published. So with the exception of this guy who's published absolutely loads and collaborated with quite a lot of developers, most software sort of created in scientific isolation. So this is one software, that's another software, and they don't really interact with each other, which is strange considering how much they should actually have in common. So when developers actually interact with each other, it's more indirectly through like power users, people who use this software a lot, try and work out what it's actually for. And they become even more linked by super users who collaborate with a lot more developers, a lot more scientists. And these guys are really, really important for developing the science and the software at the same time. So just as an example, with the Mclnerny software, it was published in 2006, and the original method was shown for species distribution modeling in 2004. Then lots of people have published with it all the way up until now, so that we've had like 1,368 citations of that software by 2011. But in 2011, that's when an explanation of Mclnerny was actually published in terms of the people who use it. So the paper is going to be massive because there's so many users of the software out there, but before then they didn't actually have an explanation which was written in their terms for the users. So it's just an interesting thing, like software and science co-develop at the same time. So, okay. So all that sort of journey that we've gone through the interviews, the survey, and looking at the co-authoring, it's kind of made me think that this kind of software, which is the right, is the more obvious software to produce, is the wrong software to produce. Like in trying to introduce a new scientific method into the community, we have to think about the sociology of that community in terms of its own domain, and then think about some of the computational challenges in that context. So like all these are different things that we're doing at the moment, either projects, papers, or workshops, and they're all feeding into like us understanding the reality of the scientific problem in terms of the community and also in terms of the technology. So like whilst it is difficult, it's like an immensely rich way to go about things. So like if you took anything away from the talk today, I would say good policy relies on good science. So bad policy is going to be based on things which aren't necessarily as sophisticated as they should be in terms of the species distribution modeling example. And that good science relies on good software. So from top to bottom, we really need to think about the way we do science, the way we do computational science with scientific software. So yeah, it's not all me. Like Drew, who's my main boss, we've worked a lot on the statistical ecology. Rampal, we've worked on like philosophy of the niche, and that's been an immensely rich exercise in kind of pure ecology. And then all these people in the middle, Richard, Kenton, Stephen, Lara, Lucas, and Kenji, have been working together on the scientific software, which has been a challenging but rewarding exercise as well. And thanks to Microsoft Research Connections and Microsoft Research Cambridge. And thank you for your time.
Let's take one quick question and then we'll switch It's a kind of a question or an observation, but I think some of the problem with software development in science is it starts off with a postdoc, say, developing the software, which is done very much in-house and with not a real software development policy. And I personally really feel science should move towards a user-centered software design approach from the beginning. So actually involving scientists in the area and quite an iterative cycle of software development. It's an observation, but also a question.
Issues as they're developing stuff, and yeah, it is demanding and takes a lot of resources and time. So yeah, your observation's right.
And at that point, they don't really want to switch, or they are very reluctant to switch, and there has to be a good reason to switch once they do that. And they are, I think generally, they are comfortable getting comfortable in using toolkits and taking modules and assembling them slightly different ways. But there are very few people who are willing to undertake the writing and generation of a major software package. So most of the scientific community is sort of patching existing modules together. A lot of today's scientific software is still based on a very aged technology. So some of the roots are still in Fortran and maybe transcribed from Fortran. Little distributed computing mixed in, and generally very little source control. So very, very ancient 20-year-old, at least 20-year-old software methodologies. There are HPC users, supercomputer users. They are a tiny fraction of the community. Yet a lot of the resources in the community, both in software development and in hardware resources, are spent on this supercomputing community. And there is very little happening that the results of these simulations, for example, would ever be accessible for a broader community. Data-centric computing is increasingly important, as Jim said so many times. And then much of the scientific software is reinvented over and over again, unfortunately. And no cheap off-the-shelf solutions are in sight. I mean, cheap is, of course, meant in quotation mark because people generally don't pay for scientific software, or very, very little, except for the occasional MATLAB license or IDEA license. But the problem, I would like to focus on the off-the-shelf. So really, I will get a little bit into this. What's the economics? So what's the price of software? Well, it's increasing, and it's a large fraction. So especially for some of the big science projects. So I lived through SDSS, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And in the beginning, the planned software budget was $2 million out of 25. The whole project ended up to be 100. And running the software and the whole data processing effort, so writing and running the software, was a third of the project in the end, 30 million. So this was the biggest mistake we made, I think, when we set up the project. We way underestimated the software. LSST is doing better. They are now estimating that not strictly the software development, but the cost related to the software will be almost half of the cost of the project overall. One of the challenges with these projects is we cannot do everything for everybody. Okay, and so where do we draw the line? And there is the famous Pareto law, the 80-20 rule, you know, that 80% of the wealth is is owned by 20% of the people. But it also has to do more for long-tail distribution. 9% of the people look at 10% of the web pages. And it's also, so we cannot do S-string for everybody. So we kind of take the 20% would so currently, again, reading the wheel over and over. Sloan wrote about 1 million lines of code. Stars is completely, in astronomy, completely rewriting all the software from scratch. Okay, and LSS is rewriting it. I believe, by the way, LSS finally do it right. So they are trying to create such methodology, etc., to be sustainable and use for the rest of the astronomy community. So they okay, factors of 3. If I write code for myself and I use it, that's a unit 1 cost. If I want to give it to my kids, use it factor of more effort. If I want to scrap it and have it used by a community, yet another factor of 3. Who's paying for it? So if I'm right, I'm not willing to pay the next factor of 3. There has to be a what is it? And also we need to be able to replace software for other disciplines. We write astronomy. There are modules be applied for earth science or vice versa. Okay, there's cost of data. But what is it? It's what we pay to get the data. But in a sense, the NSF pays to create papers. I think that's called a reasonably successful amount. Okay, so that is pay at this, then it is worse. Died off. Data at more efficient rate, and it will be reused times. Sort of the cost of total for software and the business model and year pass. So again, so if somebody who pays, this is area, so that who budget. The rest of the scientific process. To move and save, and we are getting to the point where we cannot even save them because there is so hard. Actually present and how inter the existing scientific mechanisms, which is so limited to journals. So there will always and be an open modular system because people are going to take a few modules, stick them together in a different, then create another module and so on. And this is sort of the organic incremental evolution of software. Archives are also becoming computational services. It's basically cheaper to process than move. And then we have to find the right balance of trade-offs in between the features, basically. What is the diversification and agility? I will get to it on my next slide. What does this really mean? That in the world, everything is a fractal in the ecosystem and everywhere. We have to understand that there are trade-offs in everything that we do. So that if we buy a computer, we decide we don't want a supercomputer, but we want a desktop machine, or we want a mid-sized cluster. And we have to understand also that science, and eScience in particular, needs very different trade-offs from the e-commerce. Be the e-commerce, you know, the Gmail or Hotmail, or the transaction processing. At the same time, there are lots of similarities to the business analytics. So eBay built, for example, a remarkable environment. They have 600 statisticians working on the data day by day, mining, essentially understanding the user's patterns. That is very similar, I think, the way we do science. There is a big impedance mismatch between a monolithic large system and individual users. The guys who run LHC realize this, and that's why they build a tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 hierarchy. So they move 10%, the 10% most used parts of the data down one level in the hierarchy, one step closer to the users. And they again take 10% of that data again one step closer to the users. And this creates a very nice impedance matching. So what is the pro in aggregating to very large scales? We can solve problems that exceed the group size and the current things, and it forces people to collaborate. But when this was discussed at Hopkins, people freaked out. They said, are we back to centralized computing? Because they don't want any of it, because there is no trust related to a central organization. And so there is this, so this is basically, the larger systems are more efficient, but smaller systems have more agility, and I can control my own environment in a smaller system, so I only have to trust myself. So how can you make it all play really nicely together? And I think that the answer is essentially that one has to build a fractal-like hierarchy, so computing and software and everything on all scales. Instead, what we build today is basically having some very large supercomputers and then essentially tiny, tiny clusters, but without the whole power law distribution in between. What we see, again, like in natural in ecology and ecosystems, there is a natural diversification happening. So diversity increases, no matter what. And we have these natural evolutionary pressures. I have a finite amount of dollars, and then I would like to milk every little bit out of it, so I'm tweaking the system. If I need lots of floating point calculations, I move to GPUs, and then I take at least and convert the kernel of my code to GPUs, because I get a factor of 100 out of it. If I have lots of IOs, I build a system that runs high AMDAL, which has a high AMDAL number, so which means I can read very fast the data and I don't burn up too much power on the CPUs. We see stream processing emerging for some projects. And in software, we also see, here I just focused on the data-intensive part of the software. A few years ago, it was basically a choice of trying to scrunch software licenses from Tony for SQL Server, or to send lots of money to Oracle or to IBM, or to use maybe MySQL and switch to Linux. Today we have a bunch of other options, so there is a plethora of NoSQL solutions emerging. Lots of free column stores like MongoDB. Then so Mike Stonebreaker is building SciDB. So suddenly there is this whole diversity of things to choose from. And it's all in flux, which is great because, again, I think in this environment, when there is a total chaos, there is also an opportunity. So even a small group can actually come up with some new ideas and create something interesting. So individual groups all want subtle specializations, but if you notice, this is all done on the surface. Okay, but there is what remains in the middle, which is common, is the data management, because nobody wants to do it, yet everybody has to do it. And what we see is that we see kind of boutique systems are dead. Nobody can afford to build a boutique software system anymore. It has to be put together from commodity components. Same thing for hardware. So these are really generic patterns that I see emerging. Sociology, the big changes are that more and more of the data collection is happening in large collaborations. So, you know, so LHC, Human Genome Project, NEON, Virtual Observatory, you name it, SDSS, LSST. The analysis is decoupled, and of the archive data, which is great because we had, again, decades of science growing into ever bigger big science projects, and now we actually have, again, the chance to do small science. I can go to the archive, and if I have an idea, I can use this data in clever ways. And we see the emergence of the citizen and internet scientist. I think the right expression here is I want to emphasize the internet scientist versus citizen science. So this is a particular kind of citizen science where the internet technologies are deeply embedded in every step of the process. Impact of the power laws. Everything comes in octaves. And we have to realize that the scientists may be just the tail of our users. I think both Sloan and Galaxis who told us that for astronomy, there was roughly how many? About 100 people in the public for every professional astronomer who were using the data. And last bit, embracing change. Why would people change something that they are comfortable with? Basically, when the current tools are either inadequate for the job, or the new tools are subtly better, but it has to be an overwhelming gain to essentially overcome the psychological barriers. So think about when do you switch laptops? It has to be a factor of a few faster. It has to be a factor of 2 lighter. It has to be much easier to use, or there is a peer pressure that all my friends switch to the new laptop. Okay, and we have to realize that many small steps are much, much easier than a single big one. So, and there is a message here because in the outside world, the boundary conditions change every year. So 12 years ago, it was Corba, then it was grid, computational grid was everything, and that was here to stay. Then it was grid services, then it was web services. Today it is the cloud. And I bet that in 5 years there will be something different again. And we don't know what it is, but there is the Gartner hype curve. Always the current hot technology is at the peak. So, and our job in a sense for science is also that we have to dampen the impact of all these changes in computer and information technology on the community because they are not going to switch every 2 years. We have to break it down into lots of little steps for the community. And the last bit, I would like to reflect on standards and services, because again, in this environment where we start to set up these bigger and bigger projects, I have seen this proliferation of standards. So standards are good, no question. Fewer standards are even better. Because I have seen it's much easier for projects to design hundreds of different standards instead of building small services which use only a small number of these, but they are very cleverly designed. So there's a lesson to be learned from Dropbox or S3, where the interface and the API is jokingly simple, yet they are doing exactly what is needed. And I think this is the challenge of the science software. Everyone wants a piece of software that does exactly what is needed and no more, no less, except everyone wants something different.
I want to get on train earlier. Kenji asked me to talk a little bit about a project that we're running at the moment, which we've called the Smart Research Framework, which is actually taking some bits of software which somebody pointed out were entirely developed initially in our labs and then trying to make them usable for other people. And I'm not sure the factor of 3 is correct. I think it's more like a factor of 10 when you look at the effort required to redo the things you should have done correctly from the start. The issue is we're in a lab. Everybody wishes that they recorded their data a lot better at the beginning. There's a lot of personal agenda to get it right. You will save a lot of time yourself, let alone the agenda for the supervisor who wants to be able to use the data after the student has left. You know, the graph that you have to measure, I don't have enough details, it doesn't work now. Sometimes that's for real. Mostly it's because you failed to record your, what you actually did. So we're all smart people, but sometimes as smart people we need a lot of help. We're too busy concentrating on one thing, want to get the software, as you say, really simple, record these experiments, get the stuff down, record it as accurately as you can with as much context as is extractable from the student in a reasonable amount of time. As they learn it works better, then they'll put more in. We also have some other agendas. There is unfortunately fraud in science. There's fraud in every community. There's also getting caught out with things that you've not really done anything wrong, but your media profile is not appropriate. And those guys got caught again recently. They're really very unfortunate in UEA. And the lesson is, as the BBC, show you're working. Probably taught that at school. Why does it change? It doesn't. The whole business is show what you've done and be able to show what you've done. So you've got to record it properly. The long tail's been referred to. Ian Foster was looking at this, the NSF numbers. Their grants have a long tail effect. This is the size of the institutions in the UK, the higher education institutions, and you can see there's a long tail here. A few Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial up here, the rest of us all down here, and we've all got to work together, and it's very costly to get the software to work together, but it's also very important. Let's look at the students, because if you don't provide the software, the students will have to write it. That time takes them away from doing their chemistry or physics, and of course they'll write it themselves because they won't have the ability to look around and pinch it. So the real lesson is not invented here is good, not bad. That is a real problem. Some programming so they know what's going on, but most of them should avoid doing it most of the time and leave that to other people to write the programs, but leave it in such a way that it can be adjusted and configured when necessary. Lowering the barrier to adoption, I think that's probably going to be the biggest lesson why the cloud is useful, because you can put up the services. They don't need to make arrangements with anybody else to use the service. Potentially just get a credit card out, and that's about the worst. And if it's a Dropbox system, as been pointed out, you can get going anyway. Of course, intuitive, usable software we need. Open standards. So not only very few standards, they've got to be very open, and the data's got to be stored in a way that doesn't lock it in to a commercial system and worry you about where you're going to get out when it all changes. And we want to facilitate the collaboration and must provide a much greater degree of provenance as you're recording it, so that when you finally produce the paper, it is all available. Our project's funded under an initiative in the UK called the University Modernisation Fund. Most of that money is being spent on making sure that student records can be moved around the universities, something that doesn't work very well. And we've got a little bit of it, and we're trying to replace the written lab notebook. And we've seen how expensive paper is. We're trying to do a bit better. You can look at some of the details on the websites. But basically, we've got a system, three systems, one of which is a fairly simple blogging system, but designed around the data so that scientists can record what they're doing with relatively minimal metadata, i.e. we don't force people to do things. We've got another system coming in which is much more semantic, that if your community is ready for it, then it takes advantage of it. And we also route a lot of the data around in the lab with the message passing system, because on the grounds that if you can get the data off the equipment and into your lab notebook without anybody intervening, it's much more likely people will comment on it there, thereby starting the whole chain and improving the system. And the idea was to deploy this software in the cloud, and one of the reasons for doing that is actually to attract people to using this cloud that the HE sector is going to fund, or was going to fund, might fund, not quite clear. So again, it's very important the software is usable, otherwise it will defeat the purpose of the funding. Some of our software is being used around the world to do this blogging. Some's part of the open notebook science, so it's actually it's nice because we can actually make those lab notebooks available and people can see what we're up to. The more semantic version actually allows you to generate new types of these lab notebooks by taking our Blog3 engine, adding in an ontology, since there's a planning enactment one that makes into a lab notebook. You can slot in other ontologies here as and when they're available and get a more powerful electronic lab notebook. But again, only worth doing if the community is ready to do that. Otherwise, it just causes more trouble and will stop people using it. In chemistry, we are sadly lacking in freely available and easily usable services. If you've got lots of money, you can get some. But we make much use of the ones that are around, for example, ChemSpider, and so we have a variety of ways of putting molecules in, and it pumps it round in a cycle to produce all of the information or find all the information that might or might not be known about the molecules you're putting in, including, of course, all the safety information. And in the UK, you are required to fill in your safety forms before you start an experiment, and we have systems that make use of that plan in advance to provide the metadata in advance of doing the experiment. Much easier to get people to do it in advance than afterwards when they're finished with their experiment. As I said, we pump the data around. We use a message passing system. We currently use an IBM system, but we move the messages around, and they can be archived, displayed on all sorts of different devices. The broker system makes it much easier to add in new services to that, and one of the main ones, of course, is to get it into your lab notebooks from which you can then comment. We can also then look at the data in lots of different ways on your smartphone or out on the web. And one of the important things that I feel is necessary to make it feasible to do is you plot up your data like this. You would have in parallel the environmental data of the lab, so you know what the conditions were. Click on a point here, and you get the data that's behind it, and so on, tracking back all the way through to your raw data. Find the big spikes when somebody wandered into the room and caused some trouble. This is from provide actually and spend writing poor software because they weren't how to do it. That's a great on resources. Thank you very much.
Okay. We didn't have questions. We questions would be interesting to open up to the audience here. Just wondering if anybody will try and to kick off the discussion, maybe act off with a question for one of the previous speakers on one of these topic comments. Are we all done?
So, my name's Neil. But my is, and it's not come up some of the conference. It's clear that one of the things that needs to happen is a change to the culture and a change process of we reward doing things ways I think are so the ways that you presented, making sure that we change the interaction, making sure that we use that we change the process of software for science. So you change the reward process.
There cannot be a stick. It's hard. It's a journey.
I think we can kind of to that. If I built, first of all, I will see whether I can buy it, because if it's already been made by somebody and sold commercially, preferably for some other use, it will be cheap enough. But I'm allowed to ask money, justify. But if I build, I have technicians, you go to talk extraordinarily skilled engineers who will then build, and they have a career on that. Not clear why it moves that way. The problem is that we're running too near the curve of what can be done. And so that we've got to the people that you're asking to be the equivalent of the technicians are difficult to reward. I also think that we reward our technicians nearly enough for the things that they already do. Our glassblowers are extraordinarily skilled. So we have to recognize that that technical backup is part of the work. And of course, putting them on the paper is the first move. And that's often not been done with the workshops. It is done a little bit more with the software, but not done enough, and not enough recognition. And that's what it comes back down to in the end.
When technicians get trained, do your your software developers get trained?
I think that's the problem. If I as a chemist go and try and get hold of a software developer, I have a major trouble finding the right sort of people. Well, if it's my graduate and postdoc, increasingly, yes, I try and send them and park them with people, the OMI people, for example, which you set up, so that they do learn the right skills. Now, it is questionable whether all of them should do it. I have some students, physical chemists, often go off in this area. I'd rather send them out to the software industry, having understood what software engineering is about. More interdisciplinary interactions would help this, because then they would be being supervised by people who actually do understand that, and that would help. So I think a wider, more dispersed training would be good.
And I would also like to make an analogy. I think software, in many sense, it's a little bit like the art. So that there are people where, 10 mediocre people don't make up a really brilliant program, or a really good programmer, and 10 brilliant programmers, or 10 very good programmers still don't make up a brilliant programmer. It is the same thing as with art. So we should reward it also somehow.
Okay, so is it not easier to train a computer scientist to write the chemistry software than a chemist to write the computer science software?
We're trying a test case. I have an extraordinarily talented computer science student working for me, and I would say in a team, he can help write the chemistry software, because he can write with effort, and I would hope that I am in an unusual position to bridge this gap. We can work out what needs to be done. But no, actually, each of these disciplines at its core, if I take one of my extraordinarily talented organic chemistry colleagues, there is no way that a talented computer scientist is likely to be able to have the insight necessary. And therefore, without interacting with them and seeing what they're doing, they won't, with the relevant bridges, they won't actually write the right software, when we've seen that many times. You have very interesting software, but it's not any use to the chemist. So I think you have to get the groups of people together, and you have to find a language which they can talk together, in which they can talk together.
Yeah,
and we did do that with
obviously you need collaboration, but I'm kind of trying to say that you need the computer scientists involved a bit more.
you need
in
the
software development, because they're very much on the fringes. So
Oh,
the computer science departments sit by themselves and don't actually think about eScience much at all.
I would agree with that. I've been very lucky to work with computer science departments that have a significant interest in doing the eScience. Yes, you need. It's like the pure and applied chemists. We have the same problem. You need both the theoretical founding and the software developers. You need all of them working together.
Yeah, and I would like to add, though, that bringing sort of a chemist and a computer scientist together is also a necessity, because today's people are very much eye-shaped. So they are very deep in their own narrow areas. But ideally, it would be good to have people who are equally deep in both areas, who both can actually write the software and understand the computer science principles and algorithms and data structures, and also know the chemistry. And I think it's not unreasonable to expect or to seek to train such people over the next 10 years.
I'd like to be provocative in return and say that computer scientists aren't necessarily the best at writing software. They may do research in computer vision, they may do research in machine learning, but they're not typically writing software programs which are complicated things. And I came to the conclusion, and it was partly with the OMII, that you need three types of people. You need computer scientists for novel algorithms, you need scientists who know what the problems are, and you need IT experts who can write software. But I think there are three categories.
I think I would also now think that there was a fourth category, which is you need the people who are experts at understanding and seeing what people actually do, because it's the user interface problem. And actually, you can get your even talented programmers who can program anything. You can get the chemists who are doing things, and they can sit there together, and they can completely miss what was actually needed to make it work. And there are a few individuals who can sit there, and they just look at the screen, and they look at the people, and they'll tell you, you need to move that box from here to there. A totally trivial change, right? Except it makes all the difference to making it work. And that's another skill that's in there somewhere that we haven't valued enough. It is design. It's why you open some boxes the right way around. But there's also huge cultural effects on that. The example I give, my wife's first language goes the opposite direction to mine. So when there are banker switches by the wall, and I say it's the first one, you can imagine the arguments we get into, because she always switches the opposite one to me. So there are deep cultural issues about where things should be. So design depends on culture, and the culture and the design need to be reflected in the software that's underneath.
Can I take a follow-up to that? I think, yeah, I agree with that. Basically, it's not a case of saying that there are certain specialists that are required for creating good scientific software. It's a case that there are always specialists, and it's a case of understanding which specialists are required for your particular domain. And there's not one size fits all. Some will require user interfaces, and some will require domain knowledge, some will require software engineering knowledge, some will require algorithms. What I think is still missing, though, is for us as a scientific community to get to the point where we have these teams standing as a matter of course. Because what I've seen in some other communities is very interesting. I'll give an example from the geosciences. The geosciences, we were looking at this as a comparison to the idea of could you have a standing force of software engineers that could be loaned out to the community. So, you know, you have a pool of resource that can be called on by any research group. And the analogy was made with the geosciences, where that they have the similar thing for doing ship inspections. So you get the ships which go out onto the ocean, collect data, come back again. So you have ship inspectors that check the seaworthiness of these ships. And what's happened is that because there's been a long-term contract for one or two companies to look at these ships, you've ended up with ship inspectors who happen to know a lot about the way that science is performed on ships, and you have people who are ocean-going scientists who happen to know a lot about the best way to make their ships pass inspection. So you've had a coming together, and because you've had a standing set of people within that community, you gain more than simply having generic ship inspectors coming in. And I think that's where we need to be for science, is that we're not yet to the point where we consider, for instance, software developers, numerical algorithms experts as being standing members of our communities. It happens because they are exceedingly brilliant people who want to collaborate, not as a matter of course. And I think that's really where we need to get to. I think we just have one more question.
I just have a comment. I don't know if, well, it's not a question certainly, but it's one of the observations I've made. So I'm currently in a project in Australia where we provide an e-research infrastructure for urban researchers. At the same time, I share a household. My partner, she's an immunologist. And what I've observed often is that we might be perceived by a lot of scientists from different domains as being a little bit arrogant. Because we tell them how they should be doing their stuff. And also because we're deeply passionate about improving the tools and thinking that it can be done better. But they don't really care how the analysis can be done better, or that this, you know, you could script it better or whatever. They just want to do their stuff, not our stuff, better. And so that's just one of the observations. I don't know how to come to the core of the problem, but well, I think communication and really trying to work for them, not for us in it.
So, you know, another Jim Gray quote feels appropriate here. So Jim said that I love those collaborators who are desperate. Okay. And they are willing to change their ways. So.
But I think the other side is what's the reward? Because if you're commissioned to do something, and that's the way, and you get your reward through a financial arrangement, you will do within reason what is requested. You will advise them some things, but if actually you're trying to get the reward because by doing the best and the new way of doing it, you will get the paper as well, then of course there's different driving forces, and those will pull apart. It's certainly true there. I do know some people who are very arrogant. Quite rightly, they can do the better job, and it is always knowing in any piece of research when is the best time to stop and actually get some results out rather than keep getting things better. It's very difficult, and it depends upon the relationship between you. And it's these long-term relationships which will produce the best yield, but the driving forces for promotion, for tenure, whatever, tend to work against many of these things at the moment.